I'm really excited about this topic. My name is William Sparks from ACDI Avoca, and I've been there for 11 years, practitioner working in the field primarily. And in my role, I work on a lot of strategic initiatives, and I find process mapping central in the work that I do, whether it's rolling out a new initiative or going back and fixing an initiative that got broken or isn't quite functioning appropriately. And I'm really excited about this time of the year because this is the Inside NGO week each year, but better than that, it's the season of the road trip, right? This is when we go on road trips. Now, how many of you this year have gone or plan to go on a road trip? Let me see a show of hands. It's about 32% of the room. Yeah, it's good. So in fact, that's pretty much in line with statistics. It says 1 in 4 Americans will take a road trip this year, 5 hours or longer. And that's what we're going to do today, is we're going to use that analogy. And workflow is a lot like a road trip. You want smooth sailing traffic, and you don't want to face this, right? You don't want gridlock. You want processes to flow. You want activities to flow. And this doesn't matter if you're in human resources. It's important, whether it's your hiring process, your onboarding, benefits, all of those workflows. It's important if you're in procurement, right? Getting the bids, getting the orders in, actually getting the goods and paying out the money. This is important in IT. If you're making your upgrades, you're making your enhancements to your systems. It's very important. Also with accounting, that goes without saying. You know, closing your books at the end of the month, payroll, all of those items, and fundamentally the operations, the very reason why we're in business. It's very important that we're able to have good workflow for those to happen. Because without good workflow, your organization can look like this. And that's what you don't want to have, where processes stop and you have to watch people find workarounds to systems that aren't functioning well. And if you're good at workflow, it really helps improve that efficiency across the organization. And that's self-evident. Something else that it does is it helps you avoid overhauls. So many times in our organization and in other organizations, when I speak to people, they want to do a major change. Oh, we're going to get a new vendor, replace the computer system, we're going to reorg because it's such a mess, and we're going to put them all into one person or separate it out. And sometimes you can solve these by just addressing workflow issues. It also helps establish you as a leader in the organization. The most troubling workflows that I've seen are those that cut across multiple departments or units or from the field to HQ. And no one owns those because they cut across multiple departments. So it helps you to stand up and say, I will lead this and make this activity better. And ultimately what that does is it helps people focus on the mission rather than the bottlenecks, rather than the workarounds, and rather than the issues that people are facing. And fundamentally, we get to help the beneficiaries because with better processes and systems, we can do just that. So I have 2 things that we're going to talk about today. We're going to talk about the 5 steps for mapping the workflow. So we'll get a workflow mapped and show you 5 easy ways in which you can go about this. And then we're going to talk about how you can improve workflows, some strategies, some tips, some things that we've learned over our years at ACDI Avoca as we've enhanced a lot of these workflows. So at the end of the day, you're going to walk out of here as workflow gurus. You guys ready? All right. So that's good because I packed up the car, threw all our luggage in. We're going to go on the road trip. And the first question that comes now is, what's the first thing we need to know before going on our road trip? Where we're going, right? That's very important. We need to know the destination. And there's a little bit more than just the destination that we need. We need to know some details and specifics. Some people call it a needs assessment, but that gets a little heavy and deep. It's really, what is this process? What is it going to get us through? And so if we're on a road trip, we would say, what city are we going to? Okay. You also want to know what relatives and friends are we going to visit along the way or at the destination. How many hours of driving are we going to do a day? Is it going to be 10 hours, 4 hours, spread out? Will there be fun stops along the way? Are there going to be fun activities, or is this just hardcore? What will we do to occupy our time in the car? Are we going to be playing the license plate game? Everyone's going to be tuned out to their own devices. What are we going to do? And we'll be staying in fancy hotels or camping. All right? These are all decisions you have to make on your road trip. It's similar when it comes to your workflow and defining the destination for your process. So let me give you 2 examples that we used at our organization. First and foremost, we're talking about buying an airline ticket. You think that that's a pretty straightforward process, but It's time sensitive. By the time you reserve it, need to book it. A lot of people traveling last minute, people traveling from all over the world. We needed a centralized process a few years ago to figure out how can we streamline this. But we realized this destination definition is not enough. We had to add what were the requirements and put more to that. And so we added, well, within 15% of the lowest available price. That makes sense. We also added on, according to Fly America rules, because we receive a lot of our funds from the U.S. government and had to comply to that. We also had to make sure that they were booked with 2 or fewer stops to the larger international cities. We also had to make sure that they could be purchased within 24 hours of the request. So our workflow process has to be slightly more defined in that destination than just that first sentence of buying an airline ticket. You have to provide those additional details to describe all the parameters around your destination. The second example we had was hiring a new employee. Anyone have organizations that hire employees? Yeah? Okay, good. You too. All right, so we hire a new employee, and we had to say it was for a field or a headquarters. We had to specify that parameter. We had to say that it had to meet all job requirements of that job description, which meant having a job description. And also fulfilling donor regulations, the requirements, particularly for our field staff, that was important. And the employee signs off on all salary and benefits. And this was important for us because many of your organizations, you put in a proposal, and it might be 6 months until you hear from your donor or client if you get the funding. Well, we had to make sure that our potential employees signed off on the salary up front, so it was still valid 6 months later, and that this was in alignment with our global salary scale. So you see, defining that destination is really important to make sure that's not just what's our hiring a new employee process, what's the destination that's going to help us do all of those parameters. So that's the first step of 5 steps in mapping your workflow. Step 2. Any guesses what the next step is? People? Almost. It's the vehicle. What vehicle are we going to take? Because on a road trip, you have a couple of choices, right? Someday I'll get the convertible, drive on the convertible. Maybe we'll get the RV. Now, how many of you are in this camp now? Broke down, got the minivan for you and the kids, right? Yeah, I never thought I'd do it, but I'm there. So I got that. Maybe someday I'll go back to the motorcycle. But you have to determine what vehicle you're going to take on your road trip. It's the same thing in a workflow. You need to know what vehicle you're going to take. Now, you might ask yourself, well, vehicle, what are you talking about? Well, they're usually self-evident. It's the first point of contact in that workflow. It's the device, the instrument that the user touches to initiate that workflow. So you ask yourself, what is that first domino to fall in that workflow? It's typically a work order, a request form, an entry screen. There's something that becomes that focal point. And it's important that you define that because that's going to be the instrument that carries your users through your whole workflow, and that's going to become your focal point in improving the process and educating users about the process and putting your controls into the process. So you have to very much articulate what is the vehicle that people will be using through this process. And it becomes that focal point in your activities. For travel, we used an online booking screen. That became our focal point where employees initiated that first domino. And for hiring, there was a new employee request form that started that series of dominoes. And so we made sure that we defined with all of our workflows what's the vehicle that we're going to use. Is it paper? Is it an online screen? Is it a website? Be very explicit and get that agreement with all of your stakeholders around that vehicle. Step 3. What would step 3 be? The route. Yes, the route is very important. And what's the route we're going to take? So on our road trip here, you see I've marked Washington and I've marked Peoria. Now you might be asking yourself, why Peoria? I'll give you a side note on that. I just celebrated my 20-year wedding anniversary. And so people are coming up and asking advice about, William, I think I met the right person. How do I know this is the right person? And they want advice, right? And you're supposed to say things like, well, do they make you laugh? Do you share the same life goals? I've added a new one. Where is that person's family from? Because you will be visiting that city every year for the rest of your life. So if you don't know, my wife's from Peoria. So it's a decision every year. How are we going to get to Peoria? So if they have to say, they like to go up to Pittsburgh, Cleveland. My daughter wants to see the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Then they go to Chicago, want to do some shopping, and then down to Peoria. If it's my way, well, I like to go through the mountains down south, cut across central Ohio. I like things like in Indianapolis where they have the world's largest ball of paint. That is awesome. Biggest anything, I'm there, I want to see it. And then on into Peoria. So having your route agreed upon is very important, and knowing that route before you start on that road trip, it's very important. So it's the same thing with workflow. You want to get out your pencil, you want to get out your eraser, because you're going to be rewriting this as you go forward. And you're going to create a diagram, something that people can point to, not words. You're going to use pictures to say, okay, it goes from this department to here, boxes, arrows, a very straightforward diagram. We're not trying to get technical and specific yet. That comes later. You're going to rewrite this. You're going to rewrite this because it's amazing that these workflows that we're doing that cut across multiple departments, no one's entirely sure what the process is. They know what they do. They know it goes over there somewhere. So you're going to be mapping those processes, and you're going to find that there's some variations that happen. So it takes more time than you would realize to document this and find out where it goes. And you don't get into details. People like to get into details about all the things they do when that item, that vehicle, comes across their desk. You don't want to get into those details. We're just cities. Pittsburgh, Chicago, got it. Same thing, accounting, human resources, to the field, back to the COO, just general high level. And it's helpful if you can interview a couple people very familiar with the process, or you follow the vehicle. You take the vehicle, and then when you find it, the next person, say, where does it go? Who do you send it to next? Take it to that person, and you just follow that vehicle around, and you document all of those stops. And don't be surprised if you're going to rewrite this, and don't get wedded to one particular diagram when you go to create it. So I'll give you an example of one that we had done, and I squished it on to fit here on the screen. We mapped out our travel process and saying, how do we do travel here? How do we make it better? And I'm not an artist. I have to apologize up front. So I started with the employee, and there's my stick figure, the employee. And so the first thing the employee did, well, if you're fancier, you can get your colored pencils out, and you get a little fancier and draw the travel agent as such. So the first step in our workflow is the employee has to go to the travel agent, say, hey, can I get a potential itinerary? Travel agent will send it back. From there, it has to go to, any guesses? Yeah, it has to go to approval, right? It has to go to the supervisor, right? I'm not an artist. I told you. So it goes to the supervisor, who then has to approve it. But from there, it had to go on to accounting. They had to make sure there was the appropriate funds in the travel budget for that. Wasn't done there. We found out that it had one more stop to go to, none other than compliance. They had to make sure that it was appropriate, right rules, and the donor approved and all that. And then, and only then, did it go back to the employee with all those signatures. And then the employee could go to the travel agent and say, please book this now. Travel agent would send the booked itinerary, to which the employee would then send it back to the supervisor. So it was like, all right, now we've mapped out that process. And I'm giving you a simplified process, and simplified even our travel process, but that's essentially what you're doing at this high level, finding out all the stops, who does it touch, and following that vehicle through its route. Step 4, what happens at each stop? So we found that where it went through all those people on that last screen, but we didn't detail yet what happens. And on our road trip, you want something like MapQuest. You know, I mean, this was back in the old days, like 2008, right? We used MapQuest, 2009. Now we've got our GPS devices, and they're in our car. But if you think about the directions on MapQuest, they're succinct. They're short. They don't read something like this, right? They're not long, descriptive, and details that provide into that. And I give you that risk because when you ask somebody, what do you do on this step of the process when it comes to you, they're going to want to speak like this and talk all these great value and things that they do. We don't care about that. We want things short like this. Short, go south, turn right. I don't know when this became a direction, but staying straight on a freeway. So all these kinds of things. This is what you see in MapQuest. It's the same thing in workflow at this point. You just want to document in 3 to 4 words, what do you do at this step? When this vehicle comes to you, what do you do succinctly? So now if we take a blank piece of paper and we take our characters from that workflow that we drew before, you put these lines across. And in the nomenclature, you'll hear the term swim lanes. You'll hear that these are swim lanes that you map because it looks like they're going to race Michael Phelps across the pool here. And you start with that, and then you take each of those 3 to 4 word descriptions and you plug them in. So it will look something like this. The employee submits the travel request, the travel agent books the tentative booking, goes back to the employee who then has to send it to the supervisor, who has to approve the purpose, accountant who has to confirm the budget, then they had to confirm if it's Fly America compliant, goes back to the employee, who then sends it to the travel agent, who books the actual ticket, goes to the supervisor, who can then file and forward, and accounting can accrue the travel expense. So by doing that, it's a very simple diagram. You can look at one particular role of the employee and say, there's 4 steps that this employee has to do, the travel agent has 2, and so on and so forth, and you can see all the steps in that process. And you may have variations, splinter steps that go off from this, but essentially this is what you're striving to get to, and trying to get it simplified as much as possible. And you'll find some of these workflows are crazy and big, and I'll show you a real one that we did, our entire hiring process, and you'll see one on a larger scale. But you're going to want to go through that process. It's helpful if you can complete this in a group. If you have the opportunity to bring everyone that you found, and that step 3 where you found all the stops, if you can bring them into the room and say, let's do this together. If not, go around and walk a diagram around and try to capture as is before making improvements. People know when their workflows aren't effective and they know there's bottlenecks or issues. They're going to be tempted to tell you, yeah, this is how it is, but this is how we want to do it, or this is how it should be, or this is how the policy is. This is what our standards are. Don't care about all of that. Talk to me about what is the actual process now. What is the workaround you're currently instituting? Document that as is. Don't get tempted into the pretty standards or what they hope to be. So that's very important. And again, low tech. Post-its, flip charts, it's great just to get that diagram, let people move things around, and really build that common understanding. And even in that process, you'll find that there's a lot of learning as people from each other departments are learning what each other does with the workflow and activities. That brings us up to our last step. Our last step here is the roles. Now, roles are very important. And we go back to my dream car, the convertible. Pretend I'm taking it on a road trip. What would you say is the most important role here in this road trip? Yeah, the driver, right? The driver, you'd say, is a pretty important role. And you would say that they're ultimately responsible for the safety and maneuvering of the vehicle, right? That's pretty straightforward. What would you say is the next important role? Co-pilot, right? How many of you have co-pilots, whether you want them or not? Over helpful co-pilots? Yeah, I've got one of those. Yeah, a few hands going up there. Yeah, it's the co-pilot, right? And if you think about the co-pilot's role, you could say it's to keep the driver awake and to help with directions, but essentially they're there to approve, right? Right? Are you going too fast, following too close, yada, yada, the list goes on, right? That's essentially what the co-pilot does. Approve what the driver, with his own driver's license, been driving for decades, okay, that's my issue, move on. But there's a co-pilot there that has to approve what the driver is doing. So that's an important role. There's a third role. What's the next role? Passengers, right? That's a very important role. Passengers are important. And the passengers, they're not responsible, or they don't approve, but they darn well contribute to the decisions you make, right? Where are you going to eat? How frequently are you going to stop? What music are you going to listen to? What the temperature? Who's on whose side? I mean, they contribute to the trip, right? They're not responsible. They don't approve, but they are contributors. And so we have to recognize that role. And there's a fourth and final role. Someone asked last time, was there someone in the trunk? I'm like, no one's in the trunk. So it's your friends and family, right? Friends and family, either along the way or when you arrive, you have to inform them. You have to inform them when you're going to get there. You have to inform them if you're going to see them, when you've already eaten dinner, how long you're planning to stay, right? They're not responsible for your driving. They don't approve. They don't contribute to the road trip itself, but you have to inform them. So these are 4 important roles that carry over into workflow. So if I strip away the car analogy and go look at this, there's another nomenclature called Rassi. People have heard of Rassi? Yeah, Rassi, right? So it's the acronym RACI. And people use different variations of some of the different words. Contribute and A will be different words. But I like these words best because I think they best capture what we want people to do. And the responsible person is the one person who sees a task through to completion. So when you look at a workflow, you have to ask yourself, who's the R? Who's making sure that this process, this workflow happens? The next one is the A. Who are the approvers? Anyone who has go, no-go authority. Anyone who can say, niet, nope, cannot move forward, this is stopped for whatever reason. They have that authority to do that. A contributor is anyone who adds value, anyone who contributes to the final product. Not approving. Approving is not contributing. Approving is up there. Contributing, they put some information to it, they do something to it that makes it different from when it came into them. That's a contributor. And inform is merely anyone who needs to be notified but does not contribute to the final product. They get the FYI and they don't touch. So it's important that we as workflow gurus, that you guys will be in a very short period of time, that you're familiar with Rassi, and as you look at workflows, you're immediately going to be looking at those different people and asking yourself, is this an R, is this an A, is this the C? And you'll be looking at that. So if we look at our workflow that we've just mapped, and you look at the employee, what letter would you assign to the employee? R. They're responsible for this. And that brings its own problems into this, because anytime an employee is responsible for pushing workflow through a system, you're going to get variations and frustration, because the employee is like, look, I just want a ticket. Why am I responsible to drive this vehicle through this clunky process, through these bumpy roads to get it there? But in this workflow, yeah, the employee is the R. How about the travel agent? What letter are they? Yeah, C, contribute. They're contributing. They're like, hey, I have this list of cities I want to go to. They've turned that into a booking. So they're definitely a C. The supervisor? Yeah, they're approving. That's easy. How about accounting? Do they have go, no-go authority? Then they're approver. And that's deceptive. Let me ask one more. The compliance person. Hey, it's deceptive because people think, oh, I'm only checking to see if there's a budget. Oh, I'm only checking the donor requirements in that. If you can put a kibosh on it, you're an A. And it's not uncommon to have processes that a majority of the people are not adding value to this process. And I'm not saying approving is not adding value, because you're doing some risk control and mitigations. I get that. But as far as for the product itself, it's not uncommon to have a lot of A's in a process. And we're going to talk about how we're going to try to reduce the number of A's in a workflow here in a moment. First, I want to summarize those 5 steps that we've gone through. We said the first one is, what is the destination description? Meaning, what is that full list of needs of what this destination needs to entail? It's not just hiring an employee. It's not just buying a ticket. There's a whole other set of requirements that we need to make sure are complete in that destination. The second step was to make sure that we know what vehicle we're going to use. What vehicle is the appropriate vehicle that gets navigated through that process. The third one is to make sure you know the route that it goes through, and then explicitly come back. And I think it's better to break this up into 2 parts, is then to come back and say what happens at each stop. So you don't get into the weeds right away. It's great to get that high-level view of the stop. So here's the route, Pittsburgh, Chicago, Peoria, got it. And then come back and say, okay, Hall of Fame Museum, shopping, get the details later in 3 to 4 words. And then step 5, looking at all those players on your workflow and determining what their roles are. Those are the 5 steps that you can take, and then very, I'll say easily, because some of the workflows are complex and a lot of conversations, but you can systematically go through and map out your workflow. So those are the 5 steps, and what I promised us today is that's only half of what you paid for today. Half is the mapping workflow, but for today only, you also get strategies to improve workflow. We're going to do that as well. And I'm going to give you strategies, and we're going to go through each of those 5 steps and look at strategies that we've learned the hard way on what it takes to move them forward. And the first one is regarding this destination description. It's something that seems so evident, but yet so many of our meetings, we jump right into action. Oh, we need to change the vendor, or we need to change this form, or we need to train people. And it's like, stop. Having to backpedal. I kid you not, we've gone with some systems, spent a year, 6 months to a year, building and developing, and no one really said, wait a minute, what's our needs requirement? What's that destination description? What's that touchstone that we're going to go back to and make sure that our processes are true? So the first step is to make sure you do it. Take the time to do it. And make sure people agree that, yes, this is the destination description. This is what a successful output of this workflow will look like. That's important. And make sure it's complete. It has all the elements that people that would define that. You say, yes, it's not just hiring an employee, but has all of those, and make sure it's clear. And when I say the word clear, I see people say things like, oh, well, they should book a ticket as quickly as possible. What's quickly as possible? Is that 1 day, 1 week, 2 weeks? Hire the best employee. Well, is it the best employee or the employee that fulfills the requirements of the job description? So you want to make sure you're very clear and stay away from vague adjectives that send us astray. And is it shared? Making sure that all the stakeholders in that process, either people who are in the workflow or the stakeholders up above and the bosses, that they all say, yes, we all agree. This is what we're aiming for in this. It's not just my piece might only be one part of that destination description, but I understand and can get behind all of the requirements that go into this description. The next stop is the vehicle and looking at the vehicle. And to me, the vehicle and Rassi, to me, are two of the most important aspects out of this. Embed the instructions in the vehicle when you can. I can't tell you how many times people will have a process here, ourselves included. Here's the process. And then over here on a shared drive, in an LMS, on a binder, on a desk, are the instructions and training on how to go through that process. They're separated. So if you can, make sure the instructions are as linked into the vehicle as much as possible. That if someone is using your vehicle, they can very easily get to those instructions. And keep it simple, though. You don't want to overwhelm people, right? When you get in a car, rent a car, anywhere you go, it looks like this, right? It's nice and simple. You want it to look like that. You don't want it to look like that. Right? That's very complex, very overwhelming. And some people make their forms that look like that. And in fact, even ourselves, I mean, this is, as of last year, this is our procurement form. If you want to buy a stapler, you got to fill all of this out. It looks a little bit like the cockpit side. If somebody says, no, we're in the process of streamlining that. So this is something where they embedded all of the instructions in here. So you can buy a stapler, a 747, a country. I mean, you can do anything with this form. It's got everything you need in it. So it's comprehensive, but it's a little intimidating if all you wanted to do was get a stapler. So they went a little bit too far to embed everything. But at the same time, and this one we got rid of, this was the expense report that we used to use, no instructions. Somehow you had to know what all these crazy account codes were and accounting codes. And wait, is this the department, division, unit, what? All of that, and you had to go look it up someplace else. So these are two extremes of that we want to find that balance. And the way I like to find that balance is to give things the Amazon test. And I'm going to ask you two questions. The first question is, how many of you have ever purchased something on Amazon.com? All right, everyone except that guy who doesn't have electricity at his house, apparently. So, yeah, we've all done that. My second question is, how many of you have been to a training on how to buy something from Amazon.com? Oh, amazing. And you think about Amazon.com, it's a very complex system that it holds. Millions of products, thousands of product lines, tens of thousands of vendors. You can ship it multiple different ways, different forms of payment. Not sure you want it now, put it on your wish list. Sign up for Amazon Prime. And don't even get me into the digital downloads and movies and songs and books that you can put on your reader. All of these things that you can do just by browsing through and figuring it out. You can ship it to work, ship it to home, ship it to friends. You can do all sorts of things with that. They make it simple, and yet you got zero training on that. And in my opinion, the moment someone says, hey, William, we've got a new process, training starts next week on the process. That tells me right away we probably aren't done fixing the process yet. Because if you have to train people on the process, it doesn't pass the Amazon test. You want to make sure that someone can take it and follow that process through without having to get trained. And one thing that we like to do when we have a new vehicle and it's ready to go, what tends to happen is we give it to someone who's very knowledgeable about that topic. We have our new procurement vehicle, we give it to a procurement person and say, hey, test out this vehicle. Does it have everything we need in it? They go, yeah, it looks good to me. I understand it all. I get what all these accounting codes and geographic codes and all those are, right? But then you got to take it to someone who just started, who's going to be using that vehicle, give it to them, say, hi, Johnny, here's the vehicle, here's the keys, good luck. Step back and see if Johnny can get through that path. and see where Johnny gets stuck. We don't do enough of that with the vehicle. Where Johnny gets stuck, we can say, okay, we see you got confused on the geocode. All right, let's set a lookup table or provide some more guidance around on that. So you've got to make your vehicle Amazon tested, Amazon ready. And we don't do enough of that. We make sure it's got everything we need, but we don't make sure it's user-friendly on the vehicle. On the vehicle, listing the process in the vehicle is another great step. And we see this on websites now. When you buy something online, if you've ever seen across the top, it'll say, make your selection, confirm your purchase, input your form of payment, select your delivery option, final confirmation. It shows what stage you are across the top of that website. We like that because we get nervous. Are they going to charge my card yet? Do I have another chance to confirm before I'm done, right? Right? We all get anxious. But if you see that across the top, you're like, oh, I don't have to confirm until step 5. I'm safe. I can click through until I get to step 5. We ought to do that in our workflows. It's the same thing. Now, when I show you here, this is a half of the screenshot of our Swift hiring system. So this is a system that we use when we need a chief of party, we need an accountant. They entered into our system, and we put the stages or the phases of the process right along here. And these were the names of the phases that we had. There was a pending position, it was requested, it was assigned to a recruiter, it was allowanced, meaning we determined all the benefits and allowances that needed to go with it. We selected someone, confirmed, closed, or dropped. And so someone could see exactly the stages that it was going through, and they could see where they're at in that overall process. You can do this electronically. It's very easy to do it on paper forms. People ask me, well, we're not so fancy. It's a paper form. That's fine. List the stages across the top of that form, and someone just X's it out as they complete their stage in that workflow. It's very helpful for people to see where it's got to go through and reduces that anxiety just like you have on that website when you want to click and book and buy something. These two I'm going to talk about together because we talked about what's the route and then what happens in 3 to 4 words at each stop. And the first thing is to find shortcuts and eliminate stops. The simplest workflow that still meets the requirements is the better workflow. And I'll give you an example. One thing is you could look at your workflow, and we tend to map an all-in-one workflow. Like everything has to follow this way, but maybe there's shortcuts for some activities that we can do. So exceptions is an important one. For us, when an employee buys that ticket, is going on a trip, it goes to Dave. Dave's our director of security. He assesses the trip. He looks at it, looks for any security risks and any advice and guidance he needs to provide that person. Well, there's one Dave and hundreds of us. So you can automatically see that we don't have enough Daves, and there's overwhelming, and quickly we have a bottleneck. So we quickly identified what were at the time those particular hotspots that we were traveling to, and sent only those to Dave, and then the rest we color-coded, that he maintained a color-coding system and an information outreach, put that to the user to get the information they need, and he put his energy on those that were high risk at that particular time when we put this process into place. So you can have a workflow that says, here's how we're going to do for everything, but exceptions will go this way. Another thing is to establish lookup tables. And let me give you an example here. So supervisor requests a new hire. It goes to human resources where they calculate the allowances. So if we're hiring a field person, someone has to determine, well, is there post differential, post allowance, housing, all those different allowances and benefits that go into that. Why do we have processes where we send it to someone to look up? I mean, if you think about it, when you buy on Amazon.com, right, you look and you figure out what city you're going to. They figure out the tax. They figure out the shipping costs. All that. You look it up, right? Amazon doesn't look it up and get back to you. They've trained us that we can look up that information, and we'll make that trade-off because why? We get a faster reply. Imagine if you said, I want to buy these 5 things. You just had to send an email to Amazon and wait a day for them to come back and say, okay, based on your location and your shipping preference, here's the total cost and timeline. That would be aggravating. Yet we do that in our workflows. We say, hey, here's some information. We send it to somebody who updates it. So instead, we can make lookup tables, just like the shipping costs and taxes and all that, and skip that step. HR can still own those tables and does own those tables and make sure that those tables get updated on a regular basis and are important. But we can push more to the user, and the users are happy because they can control the process and make that vehicle go faster through the process. Another one is the fast lane. that we want to contribute for activities. And fast lanes is an example here is an employee requests a trip, compliance has to check for donor compliance, and then the agent books the ticket. We said, well, there's a fast lane that we can do for this. If there's recurring trips, if we know it's to the destination, a project we've already established, we can bypass this because it's a repeat item and just do new trips to that. So you can find ways to, again, to find deviations and branches through a workflow that go around steps that aren't necessary and mission critical for every activity or every vehicle that comes through your process. On the roles, this is going to be your most nuanced challenge. This is going to be you using your facilitator hat, your best negotiation skills, and this is where it gets a little squishy. Why? Well, if you think about workflow and all those A's, you're talking about people's authority, power, control, and you're starting to mess with their people's authority, power, control. People get funny about that, right? We all get funny about that. So you're going to be sensitive to that while you're working with people and going through this process. So let's look at the 4 letters. The R, you have to make sure there is one and only one. It's amazing how many workflows where you say, well, who's in charge of this workflow? It just happens. Everyone plays their part, but no one owns that workflow. And as I mentioned earlier, the mistake is if you make the user, the driver, the person booking their ticket, responsible through that workflow, because you're going to get variations. They're not the expert on this workflow. They don't care if there's a workaround. They don't care if you don't have the controls in place. They just want to get their ticket booked. Dang it, right? So they don't care about all these other issues that you have. So in our organization, what we've done is we've assigned people who are the R's for processes, even if they never use the process. So for example, for travel, we have a risk manager who oversees a variety of factors. She also oversees our travel process and watches that as tickets go through, and we've got an automated system where she can watch and make sure they've gone through each step and all the checks and controls and balances are happening. And she doesn't travel, but she oversees and monitors that process. So we have someone who is that ultimate R. For our hiring process, we have a hiring coordinator who does a variety of functions for us, and one of them is to watch that hiring process, that SWIFT system that I showed you, making sure everything gets through the SWIFT, are there any issues, and then checking with users periodically to say, hey, what's working, what's not working, what are some adjustments we need to make in the system, and keeping an eye out for workarounds. Workarounds are not bad. That's just evidence that your system isn't fine-tuned, and you can look at those workarounds and go back and adjust your process. A's, right? Those are usually too many. Your goal is to get A's to an I. That's exactly what you want to do. Approver to inform. How many of you, I'm sure this has never happened in your organization. I'll say what's happened at our organization. Periodically, one time, someone bought something that didn't get the right approvals, and it was unallowed. And then the person higher up said, that's it. Anyone ever buying anything has to come through my desk from here on out because I want to sign off on all of those. That ever happened to you? It's just my organization? Yeah? Okay. That happens, right? Where there is an issue, so someone says, okay, I want everything to come through me. So they just inserted themselves as an A into this process. And that's frequently what happens. So what you've got to help do is help determine that real risk versus one-offs. I mean, we want people to approve things, and the value that they're adding is they're making sure that we're not running into risk, we're not having issues, we're not going to have write-offs. These are important things, but you have to ask yourself, how frequently does this happen, and what's the exposure? Now, some things like human safety, you don't ever want to play with. You know, you want those controls in place. But other elements, how much risk and write-off are you willing to take in order for the large volume of activities and fluidity of your organization to occur? That's the conversation you want to have that you have with people. You want to understand that history of why does everything go through this person. There might be some backstory behind like the one I just described where everything goes through that particular person. The other thing is thresholds. Now, thresholds I know we're very familiar with when it comes to money. Over a certain amount, it has to get signed off by this person. Over this amount, it has to get signed off by that one. Well, there's other thresholds that you can set, such as if it's a new employee making a procurement, 6 months or less, then it has to get approved by somebody. If it's a project that's been here 6 months or less, then they have to get these extra approvals. After that, they don't. So you can set different thresholds based upon time, volume, that isn't just about money, and looking at how you set those up in your processes and system, because again, we're trying to make as few stops for as many of the activities in your workflow as possible. Might not apply for all, but it's a nice compromise that if you have someone who wants to be an A, and you're trying to say, hey, well, can't we just copy you on any time we make a procurement? They're going to say, no, I want to approve everything. Well, then you go down to a threshold. Well, how about if you only approve those that are in this category, or those below this threshold, or above this threshold? You're trying to make that A as small as possible, realizing that their job is to make their role as big as possible because they want to mitigate risk. We get that. But you're trying to find that balance, and that's why I'm saying this is the most nuanced part of this workflow improvement, is trying to find what's the best balance that you can make between risk and efficiency in your workflow. Creating short stuff for C's. So these are contributors, and we talked a little bit about these. Try to eliminate these and push the work back to the users. We talked about that HR lookup table. That's important. Anytime it would come to accounting, and if accounting was just inserting the accounting codes, it's to say, why can't we make the user do that? Can't we make the vehicle easier where you put in your item, it checks a box, and flips the code in for you? We can make things so someone isn't only adding information. We want contributors to be there really contributing their intellectual firepower to creating something new and using that nuanced professionalism that we need, that it depends, that situations. That's what we want them to contribute to, not just looking up and adding data. And simplify where you can. I can't stress this enough. Give it the Amazon test. When you think you're done with your process, find your newest employee who's going to have to use it, who's not had any training on the process, give it to them, see where they get stuck, go back and refine your vehicle. I can't stress that one enough. And I's, these are the informs. And so if I'm up negotiating with the A's, I'm consciously thinking I want to get them to an I. If they want to be an A, can I make a threshold that limits their size of A-ness, but can I get it down to an I? And under the I want to try to make it passive reports versus active notification. And what do I mean by that? If they say, okay, fine, William, I'll be an I want to get copied on every trip that gets booked. You're like, all right, that's fine. They're not an approver. Victory. The process will go a little bit quicker. But that does allow them to periodically jump into the process and say, hey, why is Joe going to Senegal? Why is this happening? Yeah, that's their prerogative, but that's what they want to have. I'd like to then negotiate a step further, if I'm feeling confident, and get them to passive notification. What that means is I said, you know what, Mr. Controller, Ms. CFO, no problem. If you just go to the travel table, you have a link here. You can look anytime you want and see all the information that you need. And so they can get that information. So to me, that's passive information. It's passive reports that they can go to, a database report that they can get that information rather than getting an email every time and getting tempted to jump in to the workflow. Well, that's better than them every workflow stopping until they approve. So, the worst case scenario, they're approver of everything. Next scenario, they're approver, but you made a threshold and limited that box. Next is active notification, and then the best is that passive reporting. That's kind of what you're thinking through as you're negotiating with each of the A's in your process. This is the power you're bringing into that process. This is the part where you're facilitating those changes in your process. So when we look back at our travel, and this is a slightly simplified version, but when we had this, we said, okay, employee still has to send in the request, the travel agent still has to book the tentative, but we can easily reroute this directly to the supervisor. That's an obvious fix. So then we can drop out the employee having to be in this process again. And then we thought, well, what is the accountant doing? Well, the accountant is confirming available budget, and we realize that, I don't know about your organization, but it takes us a few weeks after a month in to close up the books, right, and get all this data to the supervisor so they can look at it. That information isn't real-time and current to what they need right now. But we found out a way to get just that travel portion out and in front of the supervisor so they knew how much money they had, how many trips and types of trips and all of that, so we could skip that step with the accountant. So again, putting that into the user's hand or upstream in the workflow process eliminated that step. And then the same thing for the compliance person who was just checking for 2 or 3 requirements. Well, that was easy. Renegotiated with the traveling agent and said, look, these are 5 rules. If we check this box, it's this type of trip. You have to make sure it's these sort of parameters or requirements that are in there. So again, we're not making the employees have to know all these rules, Open Skies, Fly American, all that. We made sure the travel agent was aware of that, so we cut that out. Then we're able to go right back from the supervisor, bounce it back to the travel agent, who then, we didn't need this part of sending the approved request because it was right to the travel agent. And this part about sending it to the supervisor and everyone, we got rid of that and just put that into a database and let anyone look at it. So the accounting can go in once a month, do their accruals, compliance can go in, do their spot checks to make sure that we followed all of our rules and regulations. And so we've taken what was a complicated process and moved it into a few steps. This is what you're trying to do, is continually, how can I take all those boxes and make it fewer and fewer with those strategies of Rassi is the big one, to limit the number of people you have and making that vehicle simple so it almost drives itself. This is our actual workflow map that we did for the hiring process. And if you look at the top, you'll see that there's three phases. One of them is yellow. So there's actually 3 pages to this workflow, and this was the first page. You see we have our swim lanes. We didn't actually put the lines on the page, but you see there's the green swim lane for the recruiter, the program staff, and then the red for the recruiter, and then the pink for the coordinator. So we have those swim lanes, and you'll also notice after the first stop that we have the first request, or the first activity up here, which is submit request. You see it goes down to the coordinator to find allowances. You see the workflow drops down but doesn't go on from there because they just have one function in that, and that's fine. The main workflow continues on to assigning the recruiter and moving on from there. The other thing you'll notice, we put these little numbered boxes on there, and these aren't the order of the steps. We had so much angst a few years ago on this hiring process. We had so many stakeholders who wanted to weigh in about this hiring process that we put numbers on these steps, and we said, assigning a recruiter, if this is so important to you about that, we're not going to make you an approver, but we can inform you. So when this step happens, when we assign a recruiter, you will get an email saying a recruiter has been assigned. Here's the recruiter. If it's really important to you about the allowances, at the bottom there, number 3, if the allowances are important to you, when we've assigned the allowances, you can get an email saying these were the allowances and benefits assigned to this particular position. So that way people can be informed. So people typically react in a, I need to be an approver because I just want to know these things and make sure it's being done right. But you can inform them and they can still get that information, let the process go on, and they can step in if they need to make a correction. So we did all of that through these steps, and the beauty was we got rid of a lot of A's in our process, and a few weeks later, people said, William, please take me off all those emails. I do not need to be informed about all that anymore. I'm okay, let it go. So I was fine, but they had a database that they can get to all that information. So this was page 1. After we collected candidates and went to page 2, and this is where we went through the interview process. And you see on the bottom here, there's a more detail than I would suggest you typically put on a workflow. We had a lot of tension around this sort of background check. We do a background check, and what if we find out HR said, nope, we're not going to hire this person because of the background check. And people got anxious and said, well, I know Joe, he's a good guy. And they didn't have that much evidence on him, and he only got kicked out of the country for 2 years and only banned from visiting that city. I mean, right, we get into that situation. So there's a lot of tension around that. So we broke that out into further detail just to let everyone know and bring clarity around that particular part of the workflow. Even though that's all within one person's shop, you might opt to put in that much detail if there's a lot of sensitivity to around what one particular department is doing. And better that than having a lot of A's in the process where people wanted to say, oh, if it is rejected or challenged, we want it to go back up to the supervisor or to so-and-so to sign off and approve. Like, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to keep it within this department, but we'll make it transparent so you can understand the process. And then we moved to the last stage where we're hiring the person potentially, but we had to make a couple split-offs. You know, if it's a project hire, well, that's immediate. If it's a proposal, it's a wait-and-see scenario. And then even with the proposal, you have to wait, did you win? Did you lose? So there's different elements of that workflow that we had to build. So it was different channels to put into this. Now, something that I want to share with this that I found most amazing. It took us 4 months to agree on this diagram. 4 months. And you think this is straightforward. You look at it now, you're like, geez, you guys are knuckleheads. Took you that long to write that? But to get agreement, because again, that whole Rassi component, getting people to agree that, okay, I won't be an A here, but I want to be informed here. So-and-so has to consult. Oh, did they have to consult? Can we push that information back to the user? We had to have all these meetings and diagrams. I'm talking about hiring. This affects all departments, right? This affects a lot of people, a lot of controls. And so it took us 4 months to do it. It took us just under 3 weeks to build the systems out. So that Swift program I showed you earlier and all the forms and all the process, it was a breeze. Now, I've learned the hard way. I've built systems where I talked to a couple people. They said, oh, yeah, I can fix that procurement form. Yeah, we'll fix that. We fix it, we roll it out, and then someone says, no. Accounting doesn't like it for this reason. You're like, okay, all right, you go back, you fix that process, you go in, okay, now we're done. We train the employees. Okay, here's the new way. Employees train, wait, what? Risk doesn't like what? Okay, so you go back, you change it. Now you got to change the processes, roll out, retrain the employees. Sorry, version 3, use this one now. Here's the new update. Oh, someone doesn't like it. So you go back and forth with designing, implementing, training, back and forth. Spend the time on the front end. And overall, this process was one of our shorter processes. When you think about all the back and forth that it can go on, if you don't spend that time up front getting that destination description, that's when we came up with that, all right, guys, we're getting a destination description up front, very clear that everyone weighs in on, says this is the final output, and then we can go away and negotiate Rassi workflow and how the vehicle looks. So spending time on the front end on the workflow, and if you think about the majority of what I've shared with you today is all about documenting the workflow. It's all things on the paper. We haven't talked a whole lot about the systems and processes and all of that on the outside, what computer programs you use and all of that. It's getting people clarity around this diagram up front will save you so much time on the back end. I've been talking about workflows, and there's 3 essential workflows I just want to give you a heads up on, because you might go out and start talking to people about workflow, and I've seen when I talk to people about workflows, there's sometimes a disconnect because they're thinking about 3 different levels of workflow. And I'm a really easy guy. I like simplification. There's big, medium, small, essentially. The big picture ones are the relationships. That's the step 3 route. So you see some workflows that will just say accounting, human resources, COO, done, right? That's the big picture. The medium picture is more like the swim lanes, where you're showing the stops. It goes to here, then they sign off on it, they accrue it, they check if it's Fly America compliant. The detailed one, and this is the most common one I find when I talk with people about workflows, they're thinking this kind of diagram, right? They're thinking the decision diamonds and the outputs and all of that. To me, that is within someone's job function. It's like back in that Swift workflow I showed you when we were doing background checks and it had all those smiley faces and diagrams. That's really something within there. So accounting can say, okay, I'm booking this ticket. Is it U.S. government or not U.S. government? It's U.S. government. Is it a contract or a cooperative agreement? It's a cooperative agreement. I mean, they have those decision trees. Those are important. I don't find those often. That's not usually where our pain is. It creates pain if you have a lot of turnover in that position. People don't know how to do their job. But the pain that we've experienced as an organization is how it moves from department to department. It's the quality of the vehicle. It's too many A's. Those 5 steps and fixing those 5 steps, that's where the pain is, not necessarily within here. But I wanted to share this with you because when you talk and start talking workflow among your stakeholders, you have to realize what level are they thinking about workflow as they describe it with you. There is a book out there. I think this is book. If you've been trained on how to use Amazon.com, you can go buy that yourself. What I like about this book is it's literally that thin and this big. It's small, and it's a book you'll actually read. I mean, how many of you bought books and never read, right? So this is a book you'll actually read in an hour. Great diagram. I think he had so much success with this book, he came out with a 2nd edition, which is now this big, that thick. And if you really want to be a workflow geek, go read it. It's fine, but it's very thorough, everything you need to know about workflow. I think the 1st edition is more than enough. You might have to buy it through used Amazon or whatever other sources you buy. But I found that very helpful, and I like to hand that out to people who are really getting into process mapping. Some tips that I would share with you at the end is, go slow, don't steamroll. Sometimes it seems obvious to us what the answer should be, or we think we have someone in authority who tells us, do it like this, make everyone get on board with it. It takes some time, drawing out those workflows, drawing out those diagrams, negotiating Rassi roles, takes time, and you have to compromise where necessary. I want to be an approver. No, I just want to passive report you. No, okay, can we do a threshold? I mean, you've got to make some compromises and find out, okay, can we do this? And something I like to do is to do a detour, is can we try this way temporarily for a while? Can we just try it for 10 transactions, 4 weeks? Can we try it and see if it works? And if you're okay with that, let's assess it with that and let people work through their anxiety and feelings. And I'm not minimizing their feelings and anxieties because people have jobs and responsibilities, risks, controls, and real issues around the viability of the organization. But we can work through and test out new ways. Keep reminding people about that destination and saying, remember, I know this process is different, but we're creating this destination description. If we create this description, then this is good, right? So people get worried about the means. Point them to the end, the happy land. We're going to be there in Peoria soon enough. So, and then the exit, this is really important, is to involve the R. If you're not going to be the R, if there's someone else who's going to be the R, involve them. If you can involve them early on in the design, great. If you can't, because it's you and a small committee working on it, and then you figure out, oh, we need Jill. Jill be perfect to be the R for this process, then get her involved and engaged in that process. And finally, whenever your organization starts to talk about things like, we're going to upgrade the computer system. We're going to get a whole new accounting system or travel system. We're going to change our vendor. This process is so confusing. It must be the vendor's fault. We're going to, before sending people, we're going to send people to training. That's the secret. More people training on procurement, then that's the fault. People don't know how to do it. Reorg is a popular reaction because, it goes through 4 departments. We'll have these 4 departments report to the same person now. That should solve the problem. People make these issues. Before doing that, go ahead, map the process and improvement. And with that, good luck on your road trip. Thank you very much. We have a microphone. We've got 12 minutes to take a few questions. If people have questions, I'd be happy to raise up your hand, and the microphone will come to you. It's like magic. Then we'll go here and then here. Hello.
Hi, thanks. That was really very clear. So I have a question which is about, so you mentioned start with where you are. What about when you have a process and you're trying to improve it and you want to kind of pick apart the process? And so how does that process look? How is it different, if it is different?
Sure. I think it's the same. What I always want to ask people is to map it as is, because people immediately want to go to the dream process. I want it to be like, nope, start with it where it is now, and then you can go to each phase and say, okay, employee books ticket, for example. Are there issues here? Yes, employees don't know the right destinations, they're not using the right travel codes, X, Y, Z. Okay, it goes to the supervisor. What issues is the supervisor having? Like we found out the supervisor is like, I don't know what my travel budget is. I don't know how many trips are approved. So you can find the pain points as you go along that process and then try to enhance within those steps. I like to come in with that first level view and say, okay, let me look at Rassi. Let me make sure the vehicle is clean, that people can navigate through the process, and then you can find efficiencies within each of those steps. Yeah. Yes, sir. Hi.
Hi. For our organization, we're a grant-making organization, so a lot of our processes don't just cut across multiple departments within our organization, but outside of the organization as well. And for applications or reporting or a lot of things, the grant recipient is actually the driver or the R. So do you have any recommendations for best practices for working with people outside the organization when they're responsible for the process?
Sure. I'd be tempted on that because I think you're still the R. You're giving the grant. They're the sub-recipient. So my main control at someone in your organization is the R and operating that. One thing we've done just with grants in particular is, and maybe it's capital R and little r, right? You're the capital R and there's little r's there, is to make sure that they have a workflow map, starting off with a poster. We've done big blow-ups and says, here's the steps. You're going to do this milestone. You're going to produce this deliverable. You have to submit this report. You get paid, and mapping through that process. We're just now building out our sub-award system so it mirrors that same process so the users can go on and click and it follows that same diagram. But it's nothing more complicated than a little bit better looking of that swim lanes I showed you or that recruitment diagram, making sure people have a diagram and they can see where they are in that process. So when you're speaking to them, you can say, okay, you're on box 4 right now. Box 4, here are the list of requirements under that particular box. You can build that into an online system or a handout says each page has, here's what happens at this box, here are your requirements. When people understand that flow, there's more clarity. Because when you think about it, when we train them, we give them a lot of information all at once, typically in a narrative form. Here's all the 18 pages of the requirements that you're required to do, rather than sticking with some sort of picture narrative that can help them see what their elements are. That helps. Okay, other questions? Over here, blue shirt, and then purple shirt, and black jacket.
Hi, I've been working on mapping a process for some time, and it's not necessarily a complex process, but it touches lots of business units, regional offices, departments, and it's a non-linear process, and I've been trying to find a good way to map it. It's in a swim lane right now, and I don't know if I should have lines going in all the lanes and then coming back into one line. Should I take the lines out? Should I use some other tool other than a swim lane?
For a
nonlinear process.
Yeah, so for a nonlinear process, what I like to have is if it's box 1, box 2, box 3, and then goes off either crazy this way or crazy that way into a bunch of activities, I'll put a number there and say, go to sub-process, process 1. Go now to your whatever, sub-grant process. And then you have that workflow. So you want to get it to ventral linear. So it becomes a little bit of a choose-your-own-adventure. Anyone ever read those books? You know what I'm talking about, right? So choose your own adventures, you'd read page 1, 2, 3, and then it would say, do you go in the cave, do you not go in the cave? If you go in the cave, go to page 4. If you don't go in the cave, go to page 8. And so you diagram it like that. And it's okay to have multiple pages to have that, as long as people very clearly can see where it goes to from there. Because then you can post them all literally on a wall and say, okay, if it goes here. And color coding is great, where you can say, okay, we're on the blue pages. When you get to this point, go to the red page. The red page, follow this loop. If this happens, now go to the yellow page. I mean, so really using that. But separating into multiple pages to keep them as clean as possible, I found a better way to go with that. Sure. Hello?
So first of all, I just bought that book on Amazon.
All right. I wish I got commission, but and now, were you trained on how to buy that on your mobile device? No.
It took me 15 seconds.
All right.
I guess it's maybe more of a comment, but I've done a lot of system implementations, as I'm sure many people here in the room have done. And what I find when you mention the things about embedding links and embedding instructions in the vehicle, I've worked with a lot of systems that you're kind of stuck with for contract or whatever, where that's just not possible. So either there's no place for HTML instructions, or the formatting isn't good, or it's in a color that's hard to see. So you end up having to do an email with, a coaching document or a link to a drive or something. So what's your recommendation around that?
We had a situation similar to that, and what we did is we created a standalone, call it a guidebook. And what we did is when you got to this screen, or the step 2 on that computer screen, we could put instructions in there, go to page whichever, or if you couldn't, we could have the manual that follows along. So on step 2, here's this page. So it's exactly looks like that. And getting away from guidance books that are all narrative and here's all the 20 things, but very much a visual to visual. Step 2, you look at this and follow. So if you can't stick it onto that, at least have that nearby and let people know ahead of time, here's the link to go into the system use the process, here's the link to the guidebook. We advise you to download the guidebook and have it available while you're going through the process. Okay, we're back there, and then we have a question up here. Anyone back there? I think we got a question up here. There's a question. I'm supposed to say, do you say or do I say surveys? They'll fill that out at the end. Okay, you have surveys to fill out. Homework.
Hi, I really like your simplified example with the travel approval request, and at the end it went to a database, and I'm going to piggyback off of the other lady's comment. So once it ends up in the database, it seems that it stops there unless someone goes into it and searches for what has already been approved. So I didn't hear anything mentioned about an email notification mentioning that it was there. And then I had a question about the vehicle. So to me, the database is a vehicle. What if the vehicle is broken or needs some tweaking?
Well,
Can you apply the same 5 steps for a vehicle? So for example, with procurement, you want a one-stop shop database where everyone can find, okay, here are the steps for procurement. Here's where you go for this, 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 this.
Mm-hmm. All right, so I have a couple questions, questions I hear there. First, you want to get AAA. No, I'm kidding. Okay, so first the database. You asked about the database that stops there. Not necessarily, I didn't explain in there, but we had a notification. Some people wanted to notify when someone booked a ticket. There's a couple people who wanted to email, inform, but everything got dumped in the database. And that's our dumping ground. It's a database where you can go in, and if you wanted to see for this date or to these countries or over this ticket price, whatever the user's needs were, they could sort it. But I want to be clear, the database wasn't the vehicle. There was a vehicle, which was when an employee went in and said, I want to go to these cities for this reason, bill to this donor or client for this and that. That information got sent to a travel agent who then attached the booking itinerary. Then the supervisor went in and clicked approve. That was the vehicle. All of the information at the end of that process then got dumped into the database. So the vehicle was that booking screen, that information. So that's the separation between the database. As far as fixing the vehicle itself, I think it's the process of sitting down. There's 2 questions there, the functionality and the IT element, the programming aspect. The programming I can't speak to without details of what that specific system is. Get a programmer who knows how to do it. But the functionality is, again, if you have that good description defined, like this is what we need it to do, you stay true to that and stay programming to that. Where people make mistakes, they start adding other bells and whistles that aren't true to what it is we need to stay focused on. And if they want to add some bells and whistles, stop, go back to the destination description, say, okay, are we changing our destination description? Now let's go back and make adjustments to the vehicle. And I can't say enough about having new people take your vehicle, walk it through, find out where their issues are, and have them come back with what the issues are, not the procurement expert who typically designs the vehicle. Bring a bunch of newbies who knew nothing about procurement onto the team. Okay, I think we have time for one more question, if there is one more. And I'll be around for a few minutes after. But any last question?
Hi, thank you so much. This was a really helpful presentation. I've done a lot of process mapping, and I still have a lot of things that I'm coming out of this with. In terms of, I've just moved from a really large organization that has those process maps on speed, and now I'm at a smaller organization that doesn't have a workflow system. All of our approvals are in email, so we don't have the luxury of being able to use a database to kind of, automatically notify folks when it's moved along in the process, be able to assign a number and see the transparency of where it is, where the bottleneck is. Do you have any suggestions for smaller organizations that don't have the bells and whistles of the larger ones?
Sure. One thing that immediately comes to mind that when I worked with a different organization, they had no systems, no ERP, nothing fancy like that. They're just like, it's all email proven. What we created was some simple email templates that people could copy and paste. So if there's a booking request, you could copy that template right into the email body, not even a separate document, and say, here's the 6 lines, my trip, who's going, what purposes, and then you forward that email to that person, and the instructions are embedded in there. After you fill out questions 1 through 3, forward the email to your supervisor. Supervisor fills out question 4. After you fill out question 4, email this to accounting. And so in the email body, no attachments, no extra documents. Someone just had to go and copy those steps and plug that into the email, and it's a nice, cheap workaround. Okay? All right, I think we're out of time. I'll be around for more questions. Again, thank you very much.